Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. This is one of those We Have Ways where we're gonna shoot the breeze, aren't we, Jim?
I think so.
Floating through our transoms at the time.
Yeah. Do you know what my problem is at the moment?
What?
Is I can't get that George Formby song out of my mind. It's really annoying me.
We're all in the desert now.
It's fun in the Middle East. Yeah. In the Mediterranean. Ding, 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 ding. You know, it won't go. I need to have sort of, 50 minutes of concentrated highways to hell or highway to hell or something. And then
that's
maybe
thanks to Rogue Heroes, isn't it? The Rogue Heroes.
Rogue Heroes. Desperados in the desert. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. It's just, I can't shift it. What can you do?
Well, I don't know. You get an earworm. There's nothing you can do about it. And
you just got to see it through, haven't you?
You've got to see it through. Are you?
And actually, we were supposed to be hooking up today, weren't you? And I've got you something really brilliant that I was going to give you.
Damn.
But I'll have to wait till next time.
Yeah. We need.
It's not something you can put in the post.
Okay. Well, we need to talk about when we're going to do that. But that's not a discussion that needs to be held in public on this podcast.
No.
So I've just a bit of a milestone apart from the tour ending at the weekend is I have just completed reading with the jocks, right? Which I'd put in the can. I'd put all but the last three chapters in the can this time last year. And I left the last three chapters figuring, well, it'll be ages till this goes up. I'll have plenty of time to get it done. And then I had a message from Goalhanger saying, you've only got a fortnight. You need to get these recorded, these last three chapters. So this is an audiobook, Peter White's account of the last year of last bit of the Second World War as a subaltern with the 4th KOSB. Anyway, if those of you know, and it's on the Patreon as an audiobook. Anyway, but the last three chapters are absolutely amazing because they are about the very end of the war and the very last stuff they do. And the way he writes about it makes it's incredibly vivid, the feelings they have as they're doing the very last stuff. And what do they do? And how should they react? How should they react? What if they see someone in field grey? What do they do? The tension in it is unbearable. And there's this bit where they basically sit outside Bremen. Bremen is then bombed because the mayor won't submit. And then they move into Bremen to take Bremen. And the two chapters around that are absolutely amazing. They go into Bremen at night and they've got tanks with them. And White is basically complaining. The problem with the tanks is it's great that it's reassuring to have them there, but they make so much noise you can't hear what's going on. You can't hear if the enemy are reacting. You can't hear if they're all shouting to each other. You just can't tell what's going on.
Yep.
And then they get into the middle of Bremen, and he finds this building that's essentially it's a telephone exchange for the railway for the Bahnhof in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
And it's got 2 meter thick concrete walls, big steel doors, and he gets into it and can't decide should he lob a hand grenade down the passage and all this sort of stuff. It's all this absolute fingernail stuff because they basically take Bremen without any casualties. There's very little fighting. In fact, the worst thing that happens to them is rounds falling short of them from the barrage that's sort of moving through the city in stages. And so there's the whole episode in Bremen, which is absolutely fascinating because it's the end of the war. And then they move out on the 2nd of May. They move out to northeast of Bremen, and they're put in billets, and they're told to dig in and just be on stand to essentially for 4 days because they don't know what's happening. And then on the 7th of May, they're given this patrol to do, the battalion. And there's an island of land that's that's 2 miles by 2 miles by 3.
But the war's ended on the 5th.
Yeah, but they don't know. It's not confirmed. It's not for sure, right? And Hate-Will Smith's got them on absolutely take no unnecessary risks, but also the enemy's still out there. So there's this portion of land that they're told they've got to go and clear, And this is on the 7th of May. They go out on a patrol, and someone's or major has been killed on the bridge by a mine on the Jeep. He's in his Jeep and he's blown up on the 6th. So they do this thing where they sweep this sort of fenland, basically.
Yes.
And there's and it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and they see this woman running away from them, looking over her shoulder, right? And she's running. And she's obviously seen them. And so there's a debate amongst the jocks, like, should they shoot her? Right? And because, she might be running ahead to tell the enemy that they're coming.
Yeah.
So he decides no, because that'll attract their attention as sure as anything else. If you shoot her, they'll hear the report of the rifle. If there are any enemy out there, so you negate the effect anyway.
Yeah.
So there's no point. And also, he doesn't like the idea of shooting a woman in the back. The war's over. It must be, blah blah blah. So they carry on. And what he's done in the meantime is he's gone to his company commander, and he's put on the map. He's drawn letters of the alphabet. He's squared it all off, so he can radio back and go, we've gone through C now. We're into B. We've gone into A, and they've moved their mortars up to a railway station so they can have fire support, because there's no artillery support for this sweep. Mm-hmm. Anyway, they keep going, and then they see two people in field grey, and they're like, and the Bren gunner goes down, and they're they're ready to take a pop at these blokes, and then they realise that they're and White describes trying to hold the binoculars steady because he's panting. And he's full of nervous energy, because he's so full of nervous energy because it's the war. Can't hold the binoculars straight.
Yep.
And has a good look, and he realises they're farmers in like Volkssturm tunics. So he doesn't decide to kill them. And at that point, the blokes all go, "Oh, thank God for that, sir," because one of them comes over and he's got 25 eggs on him, because they've been going through farms and houses and basically searching the houses, right? And he says. And the bloke goes, "Well, thank God, and it's all written in like sort of kind of phonetic Scots in the book." He goes, "Thank God you didn't make us do an attack there, sir. I mean, it's not 35 eggs, we've 250." And they've basically, all these soldiers with their smocks, their windproofs, full of eggs, like.
Wow.
Patrolling with all these eggs, because they're basically a great long looting train. They're just looting everything you get hands on. And then they go all the way round this thing, all the way round this island, and there's a company going around, a platoon going around the edge, the next platoon coming around, and they all meet back at the rendezvous. The area is declared clear of Germans. And at this point, someone drives forward on a Jeep to collect the mortar bombs up over the bridge, and the Jeep is blown up by a mine on the bridge. And somehow the driver is only gashed on the head. And White thinks that the driver's heard that the war's over and is driving forward in his excitement to tell everybody. He thinks that might be the case, but he doesn't know. And then they find out the war's over, and someone fires some flares off. Some Very pistols get fired off. A mortar parachute flare goes up. And then the brigadier says, "That's enough of that. No discipline. What's your fire discipline? Go on, there are still Germans out there. Behave yourselves. That'll do." And that's it. So he says, so they spend this day of unbearable tension on this completely unnecessary patrol. And then the war ends, and that's sort of that. And there's no there's no party. There's some rum goes around, but there's no big party. And he's staying with he's in a billet with his civilians. And the book ends with the family, him trying to explain to the family what's going on, and there being this photo of a boy in Luftwaffe uniform and the mother's holding and crying and all this sort of stuff. And the book ends very movingly for that reason. But just his description of the last days when, no one wants to buy it on the 6th, 7th, 8th of May.
Of course not.
And they all know perfectly well that the war's ending or ended, but it's not official yet. And it's this sort of. And you wonder what they're even doing this patrol for. I mean, is it just to give them something to do? Because otherwise everyone's going to twiddle their thumbs and maybe go looking for a rum ration. It's got that sort of kind of army thinking in it. But it really made me think about, because there's in Quartered Safe Out Here, there's that bit where they're on a patrol and this officer shouts, "Chaps, the war in Europe's ended," and they all laugh at him. the borders that George MacDonald Fraser's with, they just think it's funny that anyone would care, like absurdly funny that anyone would care. And all that stuff about the very last bit, I think, is so interesting because
I agree.
Because I remember talking to Russian soldiers, all those years ago when we interviewed some Russians who talked about fighting in Berlin, and you'd break your way into another building and you think, I hope there are no Germans in here because I don't have to I don't want to fight anyone, right? Because I might get killed.
Yeah.
And I don't really want to kill anyone because it's over, isn't it? Like the sort of.
Well, it's a whole Wilfred Owen thing, isn't it? It's sort of, it's terrible whenever you get killed. Whatever happens, it's terrible. But it just seems even more futile if you get killed just before it's about to end.
Yeah, yeah. Once it's been signed off, because this is the thing, they're out on the 7th of May. It's
done. It's over.
It's done. It's over. It's completely done. It's. I mean, it is weird that they're still patrolling and don't know for sure. And I'd be interested, wouldn't it, to know how many people are killed in Germany, after it's all over. Yeah.
Because of mines, because of tripwires, because of...
Well, I mean, it's unexploded ordnance everywhere, isn't it? It's
everywhere.
It's just absolutely everywhere. Mines absolutely everywhere. Because he says that the mine that does for this Jeep is a glass mine. So it's that's the story they're all talking about. So it's undetectable. Rather than a wooden one,
absolutely horrendous. I just can't imagine what it must have been like going through, those German. You're expecting a scrap to get across the Rhine, right? I mean, whether you're American, whether you're British, Canadian, whatever, you're in for a fight. But you've got to cross the Rhine, and then you've got the scrap on the other side of the Rhine, and then it's all over. To all intents and purposes, it's done.
Yeah.
So you're then having that big second surge. It's kind of sort of like post-Normandy, where you've suddenly got the roads are kind of clear, but they're not clear because there's still people, about to jump out from behind a tree, behind a building with a Panzerfaust and all this kind of stuff, or let rip with a machine gun, or whatever it might be. And it's all just
stuff,
and it's all just. One of the conversations we've had that sort of affected me deeply was that one we had with Tammy Davis-Biddle, where she was talking about the anxiety of the Allied commanders in the spring of 1945, what if the Germans did develop a proper wonder weapon?
Yeah.
What if we can't finish this quickly?
Yeah.
Then what does that affect? What effect does that have on Japan? Where does that leave us? And this sort of, because everyone's been with it for so long, and even by this stage, even the Americans too, it's such a long, hard slog.
Yeah.
And that final winter in Europe, I think, has been so hard on so many different levels. What happens if you just can't get rid of them?
Yeah.
You just can't get this thing to end. And everything you're seeing is telling you contradictory things, because on the one hand, it's saying this country is absolutely beaten.
Well, his description of Bremen, it's like, I mean, it's...
of course.
It's absolutely, but it's been shattered, and it's full of displaced persons. It's full of DPs who are looting, and the Germans are all hiding in the air raid shelters under the city, and the all DPs are running wild, and even while the offensive's going on. So you've got there's one instance he describes where a 25-pounder round falls short on the DPs looting the Bahnhof, and people are injured, and then they just carry on looting. They're like, well, whatever. We want, and he says the boiling hatred of the displaced persons for Germany, all things Germans. It's like he said, we actually don't know how to contain it, and they appeal to they go down into the basement under the Bahnhof, and he finds the Bremen police chief or whatever, and says, we need you to restore order, and the guy goes, well, I can't guarantee I'll be able to do that. You're going to need to give me my pistol back if that's all right, if you want me to do that, but I don't know that that's possible. And it's just this sort of the sheer apocalyptic scene of it. And what's really interesting is 2 days. They go into Bremen at night, and then there's this weird day where there's sort of sniping and a bit of mortaring and all this sort of stuff, but not much seems to happen. And then the next day, sort of thousands of German soldiers and Marines suddenly appear and surrender from all over the city, because it's after Hitler's suicide, so they've obviously a load of them have decided actually the game's up. But he says the interesting thing is, is even late a week later, that you've got this thing of Germans who aren't in touch with what's going on, who don't know what's happening, who are holding out. Because it's Texel, isn't it, where there's plenty of fighting for another week.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like
and of course, and famously or infamously, rather, in Prague as well. But the point I was going to make was that, on the one, this is a paradox of a situation if you're fighting on the ground, because on the one hand, you've got this country which is completely beaten. Everywhere you go, there's total carnage. I mean, absolutely everything in normal life has just been turned upside down, collapsed buildings, telegraph wires all over the place, decaying bodies, the rule of law all over the place, people strung up from lampposts for desertion, all this kind of it's the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
And yet on the other hand, you've still got people fighting. And that makes it worse in a way because it's so utterly pointless.
Yeah.
If you've got a fully functioning army and commanders and weapons and all the rest of it, there's a sort of crazy point where you sort of go, okay, fine, because you've actually got some skin in the game here. But
yeah.
For Germans by kind of beginning of March 1945. There's no hope. There's no hope. So if you're a British Tommy or an American GI or a Canadian or whatever you are, a Pole or whatever, fighting, clawing your way through Northwest Europe, you've got so many conflicting thoughts going through your mind. One is fear and terror. Second one is we're so nearly through this. Clearly they're beaten, and yet they're not.
Yeah.
And your caution about not wanting to push forward because you're so within the finishing line, but you don't want to get stumbled kind of, a yard out from the tape, that's telling you it's all over.
Yeah.
That's making you more cautious, which is then slowing you down, which is then extending it further.
Yeah.
So it turns into sort of, it's just this sort of totally horrendous, totally ghastly scenario.
Yeah.
Which is made worse by everything you're witnessing all around you. This sort of mad world where everything has gone to pot.
Yeah.
And if you're Peter White or if you're in the Sherwood Rangers or any of these companies and units that are pushing forward, it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous.
Well,
and you can see why, Tammy was saying what she was saying and why she felt that it's too easy to go, oh, well, of course they were beaten, clearly, you didn't need to start, didn't need to kind of destroy Pforzheim. But you can see why frustration, deep anger, resentment starts to creep into the Allied commanders, because they're just thinking, what are you doing? Why are you still fighting? Why are you still going on? You're absolutely screwed. And I think you can mark the moment where it all goes, basically the Reichsbahn implodes in February 1945.
Yeah.
And the Reichsbahn has been the glue for the Wehrmacht, for the Nazi regime's sort of fighting effort.
Yeah.
Because it's never had enough fuel. It's never had enough oil.
But
it has had coal.
Far more than the Autobahn, which is what people think is the...
Yeah. Forget the Autobahns. The Autobahns are kind of, they're a red herring.
Yeah.
It's the railways that are everything. And there is a point where they've been so bombed, so destroyed, so mashed, and their ability to get coal to the locomotives and to the railway stations and all the rest of it is so limited that the Reichsbahn just implodes. It just cannot function. At that point, it is absolutely 100% game up. And what you're then dealt with is pockets. But the problem with pockets is you can't, the comms is really shaky.
Yeah.
And so
you can't be sure where any of them are and who they are and what their strength is, because that's the thing he goes on.
And that's
on
when
about.
You get Altweiler. That was it Altweiler, that village that PCA wrote about so effectively in his book,
where they decide to fight.
Well, they just keep to fight because you've got a little sort of mini Hitler's in charge. He's the town mayor or whatever it is, town leader, and he's a proper little Nazi, and he's not going to give up anytime soon. Except, of course, he does in the end. After lots of people have been killed, and what you get is this splintering where, and from an Allied point of view, you don't know whether the Germans you're about to come up against in the next village are run by some little mini Hitler or whether they've actually given up the ghost and are going to put the white towel out. I mean, and again, it's that one's fears are greater when you don't know what's around the corner.
The unknown always seemed worse than the known troubles. And so although we had a fairly shell-free night, our coming ordeal weighed more and more heavily on us with each passing hour. I feel that in part this was because we each had almost dared to hope that the war might just conceivably burn itself out before another turn for us to attack came round. Meanwhile, until this happened, we knew that the policy was to keep up maximum pressure on the enemy by day and by night, to give him no recuperative rest. So that's the middle of April.
And yeah, absolutely. 45. And what's the answer for this? You know, how do you minimise risk? You minimise risk by bombing them ever harder,
shelling the crap
shelling
out,
the shit out of them,
everything you possibly can. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in a second, but this is a thought worth mulling on, I think. Welcome back to Way of Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. And we're kicking around the idea of the end of the war and how actually that not knowing feeds into some of the sort of acceleration of destruction that the Allies take to, really, in this.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that the bombing of Dresden and Fort Simon, Würzburg, etc., is right, but I think one has to be incredibly careful about becoming overly judgmental about decisions that were taken at the time, because we weren't there. We weren't living there. We weren't living through that period. We weren't living about the risks. We didn't have we didn't have Japan hovering in the background, which was a kind of, the end of that was completely unknown as well. There's all sorts of things going into play. And if I was Peter White, I would want to know that our bombers and artillery are doing the hard yard so that I don't have to.
Well, he describes because the German air effort is over. What you have is self-propelled guns driving up to the thing they have to flatten because they can operate in the open. They don't have
and then flattening it.
They don't have to be the other side of the hill. And you see footage of that in Berlin as well, where they're dragging heavy guns through the streets of Berlin and firing them over open sights and stuff, because the Germans have no answer to that, but still need to be winkled out and killed and destroyed. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that the very first topic of conversation the night that the war ends is, for the first time, a new topic. The chances of our being involved in attacks against the Japanese was bandied about. That as soon as the war in Germany's ended, the first thing his men are talking about is going to the Far East. Little did we realise how very near we were to this thought-taking material shape a short while later. So they were earmarked to go. And that in itself is the other thing that's in the background in the spring of 1945 is we're going to, once we've finished here, we're going to have to move all of this effort to Japan, which is going to be an even tougher nut to crack.
Well, I think that's an incredibly persuasive argument. The sort of long shadow of the war against Japan. And one of the things I think we you and I have started to realise over the last year or so is just how Japan second isn't really Japan second. It's Japan a hairbreadth behind.
Yeah.
I mean, I've just been. We'll save this one, but I've just been reading up on Saipan and the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, and it is just staggering, the logistics of it.
Yeah.
And the amount of shipping involved and how much has to be laid aside and prepared and all the rest of it. Whilst concurrently carrying on a war in Italy, carrying a war all along a very, very long Western Front.
Yeah.
The Western Front now is going all the way from the Baltic all the way down to, the Alps. I mean, that's a decent stretch.
Yeah. 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 I mean, the thing, but I mean, it is this, I mean, I think in a way, had Japan collapsed earlier, would we be talking retrospectively about Japan second? Do you know what I mean? Because I know that's the official name of the policy, but you look at the naval effort, the American naval effort is colossal. I mean, it's very interesting though, because White's battalion, the 4th KOSB, they get broken up, or rather a chunk of them get transferred to 1st Battalion KOSB, who are part of 3 Div, and then they're to be sent to Florida, to be shipped, re-equipped by the Americans, trained in jungle warfare, and then shipped to the Pacific. And basically, he says, when the atom bombs fall, he says, how we wished we had reached America before this happened. We might have had a lengthy holiday. The complete end of the war came as rather an anticlimax, for now we knew it would be a year or more before we reached our turn for demob. So then he's sent to Egypt and Palestine.
Wow.
So this idea that the war ends in May 1945 couldn't be further for men's military experience. Couldn't be further from the truth. And I've just been reading Alan Allport's book Demobbed about the end of the war, which is people going home, which is absolutely fascinating.
Well, that's a whole subject, isn't it?
Well, and you know what? I was because there's one guy
really, really fascinating.
He's got a really interesting. He follows a bunch of people. There's a guy called John Frost. I mean, he's not John Frost of Two Power fame, but I think he's a soldier, and he starts to really love the life of irresponsibility, because a lot of what the men talk about is being in the services. You have no responsibilities apart from the things you've got to do. You don't have any rent. You don't have to.
No food appears.
Pay the bills. Food to find. You do as you're told. Someone else is responsible for you, right? And in a strange way, it's a lot of men find it really like a life of strange freedom. Once you've adapted to it, it's like a life you can sort of.
I just want to be led.
Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And there's a sort of freedom in that. It's really interesting. So this guy after the war, and he works in a city firm. This guy called Frost. He decides he wants to become a bus conductor instead. Doesn't want to go back to the city. He wants to be a bus conductor, work on the buses, because that's like a free life where all you got to do is work on your bus. That's all you got to do. You got no responsibility. You got to carry nothing. You're not really answerable to anyone. You clip the tickets. That's it, right? And what's so interesting though is he does that for a few years, and then he goes back to his city job. And it really reminded me of because during the depths of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about how this will change us all forever. Everything will be forever changed. No one will go back to work in their offices. The tube will remain forever empty in London, all these sort of things. And actually, sort of 2.5, we're a year out of it now. Things have pretty much gone back to not 100%, but pretty much gone back to normal. And what Allport talks about a lot is all these people they have all these dreams while they're serving, what they're going to do when they get back, the businesses they're going to set up, and the new way of life they're going to embrace and all that. And they come back, and actually there's sort of too much to be getting on with in post-war Britain in terms of, how hard it is to get a house, because 200,000 houses have been destroyed and millions damaged. So the housing stock in the country. Yeah,
that's when the prefabs come in, isn't it?
Exactly, because the housing stock's has been totally disrupted, and and that's even in the wake of all the house building in the interwar years. That was done. Particularly in sort of Metro land. In London. It's just absolutely fascinating, and it was really some of it really reminded me of the pandemic. This thing will change us forever, and then gradually, actually, people kind of returning to the mean. Some people unable to. So some people who've lived this life of ridiculous adventure, and they can't fit back into normal life, which is on the live
Paddy Mayne and co, isn't it?
Paddy Mayne, what we talked about with Paddy Mayne on the live cast the other night, that this idea that your purpose has been removed. But then also other people who go, I flew Spitfires. I've no desire to drive a car fast. I've had it all. I've done that. I've spent that part of my personality. That's done. I've got none of that left in the bank. And all of that is just so interesting.
Well, Jeff Wellham, all he wanted to do was sail a boat. Yeah. He just wanted to pot around sailing little dinghies.
But there you go, you see? And that's because rather than fly a plane under extreme rigorous test conditions and having to write everything down, log everything and be completely on top of it, you can see that bimbling around in a boat would be Brian Horrocks did that too. Horrocks, he took to sailing in later life.
Oh, did he?
That was his sort of his release.
I completely get it, because you're away from everything. You've just the sea, the wind. And
there's no telephone either.
There's no telephone, and there aren't shells going off, and you're just kind of. I can totally get it. Yeah, I totally get it.
But the demobbed is we should talk about all this more at length, and the sort of the business of coming home, the business of it's not just the demob suit, it's you also have this thing that lots of women have become, lots of couples who get married during the war. They then don't see each other for 3 years. Their war experiences change them completely. So the divorce rate goes up. But like...
Melvin Bragg's father came home and there was all sorts of trouble, wasn't there?
Really?
Because he had PTSD. He clearly had PTSD, or was traumatized by his experiences and stuff, and they found that very difficult. And I remember talking to my lovely friend from Liverpool, Sam Bradshaw, who was in 6 RTR. The guy who was wounded at Sidi Rezegh and then subsequently shot in the neck in Italy after recovering from that one. And he was amazing. And, he said that after he recovered from he got shot in the neck in I don't know, autumn of 1944 in Italy. And he got home and he said he just couldn't get over it because, his little sister who'd been a little girl when he left was suddenly, 18. Or 17 or whatever, and shapely and all these kind of things. But, she'd been 13 when he'd left. And his mother had gone completely grey.
Yeah.
And lots of buildings had gone and there was no one around and all his mates weren't there.
Yeah.
And he thought, he just couldn't cope with it. So he rejoined.
Yeah. Yes, there's lots of that. Yeah.
He rejoined and went back out because he was back, he wasn't home on the Python. He was home because he'd been wounded. But
because the other thing is what's interesting is the demob scheme is all laid out and it's all very, very fair. And then the Labour government goes, hang on a minute, we've got all these weird imperial commitments that we haven't quite sorted out yet.
Yes.
And people aren't
so it then becomes not quite so fair.
Yeah, and people aren't going home at the rate they wish they were. I mean, stuff about families is so fascinating, though, that, the stories of children that suddenly this man, they've been living with their mum for 3 years. They've been sleeping in the bed with this stuff about this kid who sleeps in her bed in her mother's bed.
Yeah.
And then the dad turns up and she's not allowed in bed with her mum anymore. And there's this bloke she doesn't know who's, and how actually disruptive all that is. Also, you've got people coming back from the jungle. There's stuff about people coming back from the jungle who, they don't use cutlery anymore. They throw the bones in the fire. They chuck the tea in the fire and all that. They've been completely sort of de-mannered by their experiences living on the land. Living in the open.
And also, inevitably, your attitudes to life are going to change, aren't they? Some things, because.
Well, how could they not?
If you're back at home, you're worrying about, how you're going to make ends meet, whether you can sort of, whether your kids are fit and well and healthy and all the kind of normal stuff. But if you've just been in the jungle fighting the Japanese for 2 years or whatever, you come back, you're kind of thinking those things just aren't important compared to, what I've just been doing. And she's like, well, okay, you might have been very brave and you might have been out in the jungle a million miles away, but I've kept the whole show on the road back here, and you just can see it, can't you? It's no one's prepared for this. No one's prepared for, they haven't learned those lessons from the First World War, the boys coming home from the First World War at all. They have in certain ways. It's a bit like all these things. It's all progression. It's a bit like the development of the airborne forces. They learn some lessons and not others, and it's interesting what they focus to learn on. What they learned from the First World War is that you can't promise land fit for heroes and not give it. So hence you have the Beveridge Report, and you've got welfare state and all the rest of it. But what they haven't thought about is the kind of mental side of things. Now we're so concerned with mental health, aren't we? And making sure that.
But we still fall short, though. I mean,
of course. I'm not denying it, but now it's absolutely part of the everyday chat, and rightly so. But it's just not on the radar. It's kind of you're just expected to just work it out yourself. Stiff upper lip and crack on.
And what after the war, there are less people who are regarded as psychological casualties, psychiatric
and also
casualties. On the army's books, and the army are quite happy with that. They want the casualties kept down because they're not.
But also, it's decentralised. That's the other thing. So that all these these squadrons and wings and ships, they have their associations and they get those up very, very quickly. Regiments have their own association which is like a welfare association. You know, there's a chairperson, and all the families donate money in, and the officers put in money, and they, you know, the younger officers plead with their parents to kind of donate money. You know, and I remember I was just absolutely staggered by that with the Sherwood Rangers, and obviously there was lots of stuff that I never put in the book. Because it just didn't fit. But some of the stories post-war were just, oh my God! You know, there was one widow of one of the great heroes of the regiment. You know, who was a sort of and bar.
Yeah,
who was killed just after they crossed the Rhine. So right at I think literally on the 1st of April, 1945, and he'd been killed, and she'd been left with 2 kids, and the boy was, you know, really behind at school.
Yeah.
Really, really behind, really, really struggling. So the regimental welfare paid for him to go to a prep school in near Grantham, somewhere like that.
Yeah.
Where's that? What county's that in? Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Lincolnshire, isn't it? So they paid for him to go, and then there were all these letters from the headmaster of the prep school going, you know, Johnny's not really fitting in. You know, his academic standards are so low that we can't help. You know, he's so out of touch with his peers.
Yeah.
You know, we recommend that he leaves.
Gosh.
I mean, it's brutal, and it's utterly heartbreaking. God. You know, so Johnny's. It's not really. He wasn't called Johnny, but I won't say what his real name was. But Johnny's mother is struggling with the grief of losing her beloved husband, who's a total war hero.
Yeah.
And she's doing, you know, the letters are pathetic in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah,
you know, they are desperate. I don't know what to do with my son. You know, I can't help him. He misses a father figure, you know, all this kind of stuff. The school takes him on. Then the school kicks him out.
Yeah.
Oh, God, it was, you know, it's just awful. And then there was all the, you know, I mean, the legendary George String, you know, he felt very let down, you know, by the Regimental Association. Didn't feel he had the support that he had. Yeah, I mean, you know, and he'd been this totally fearless tank commander,
absolute legend,
you know, and then would never go out at night. Didn't like the dark. God. After that, you know, he's a proper countryman. I mean, he'd grown up, you know, hunting and laying traps and all this kind of stuff, you know, and suddenly he just couldn't do it anymore.
It's interesting though that because class obviously comes into this too. Because one of the things that Alan also writes about is, you know, if you're an officer in the sort of later phase of the war, where you're like a working class kid or a grammar school kid who's been made a subaltern, you then have to go back to where you know it's
to being working class or whatever,
back to being working class, and a lot of those people felt they were viewed with great suspicion and great hostility for people because they'd got above their station, and that people's you know. The way the class system was rigid in the 40s in a way that we you know that it's obviously plainly still exists now, but you know, if you knew your place and you remained in your station. And he writes, you know, these people, there's a really great story of 2 blokes who meet in a pub, and they're both officers, you know, who've got through WASB and all that sort of stuff, and they're working class lads. So and they recognise each other, and they have to decide which lingo to talk in. Do they talk in their working class language, or do they end up calling each other old boy and talking like that? And they opt for the latter. So there's what you up to? Any jolly japes at the moment, old boy? And they talk like officers, the way officers spoke, so that they can communicate with each other rather than in their working class language, you know, that they would have used otherwise. Which you just think all of these things that like
yes, absolutely,
aspects and sort of you know, permutations of how British society is playing itself out post-war as a result of the war. You know, where everyone's been tossed in together and jumbled up together. You know, and
yes, and I suppose one of the issues, of course, is that you've got class barriers taking a massive, you know, being broken down during the war.
Yeah.
And then in a way, as a sort of an almost sort of knee-jerk defense mechanism by the upper classes and the kind of middle classes, there's then a, you know, so it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back again, isn't it?
A proper attempt to reassert, you know, and everyone's reasserting themselves as well. It's not like the you know, people know their place. So it's not like it's being led from the top, this. It's a thing that's happening all the way across society where people, and the other really fascinating thing is obviously at the end of the war, there's hundreds of thousands of people who have had technical education, right? Who have been trained as mechanics, who've been trained, and basically
and now have skills.
And so the British workforce is far more skilled than it was in 1939 in terms of what people are capable of. Working and repairing radios, fixing vehicles, building, fabricating, all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
And it's hundreds of thousands of people, and the British workplace just can't accommodate them. The British industrial workplace, can't find jobs for them all. So you've got people who are brilliant with radios who they end up having to drive lorries and stuff because there's nothing for them to do. And it's what the contrast, of course, is that the GI Bill happens in the US, where basically if you've served, you get a welfare state and education geared to you. No one else does, but if you served, you do, and that's millions and millions of people. Whereas in the deal in the UK is that the country gets a welfare state, not the serviceman. That everyone gets it.
Yeah.
Whereas in America it's that thing of, well, thank you for your service and you can go to university now. And what's interesting is that you don't get the university boom in Britain until 10 years after the war, until into the late 50s, which is when all these people with skills. If there'd been the universities from the late 50s and the late 40s, you maybe would have been able to do something with this skilled, technical workforce. Yeah,
isn't that interesting?
It's just
fascinating.
Just so fascinating.
But there's so many times in the war, aren't there, where there's so many instances in the war where people are just thinking, hell, the future consequences, this is all about now. It's the same with introducing vast amounts of chemical fertilizer into the land. Yeah. We're still paying for that price.
Yeah.
To this day, we don't need to worry about it now. What we need now is more food. Yeah. And just do whatever it takes. Tear up the downlands. Put more fertilizer down. Don't care. It doesn't matter how mechanized, how industrialized, how chemicalized farming becomes. Yeah. It's the now that matters. Yeah. It doesn't matter that after the war we're going to have a kind of social upheaval. The point is, we need more officers, so you've got to get them from somehow. So get them from wherever. Get them to WASB and all the rest of it. But it's worry about the consequences later, and you see that in so many. Well, many walks of aspects of day-to-day life.
Well, top to bottom. Many would argue that's the atom bomb right there. We need a bomb right now to solve this problem right now, and the fact that it will.
Let's worry about it later.
Create 80 years of extreme complications. Whatever, doesn't matter. Got to get this done.
But one always, from a government point of view and from a national point of view, you're always going to go with what is most important in the present, aren't you? You see this. Even you could see this over the summer, couldn't you? Where suddenly there was, this sort of looming financial crisis, and everyone's like, "Oh, we don't need to worry about the environment anymore because, climate change. Obviously it's really bad, but let's put it on hold because we've got a more pressing crisis to worry about." And it's actually not very dissimilar. Yeah. But the long-term consequences of those decision makings, the now decisions, have very long-term reaches, don't
they? Current inflation is surely something to do with, underwriting the economy for 2 years with furlough.
Of course.
Of course it is. Because the money has to come from somewhere, blah, blah, blah. It's fascinating.
Really fascinating. I've got this book. I'm going to have a look at it. And actually, my copy of With the Jocks was a paperback and it's completely disintegrated. So I've just treated myself to a hardback first edition.
Oh, very nice. Maybe I should buy one of those actually.
I got it for £6, so it wasn't like a massive investment.
Oh, that's good. Because the paperback I've got is not brilliant either.
It's one of those sort of cracking spines, where kind of pages all fall out, and that really bugs me. I don't like that.
And it's got lots and lots of pages. It's a big fat book.
Big time. Well done. Congratulations on getting to the end of A to B with the Jocks.
Well, I think I know what I'm going to read next, though. I think I know what I'm going to read next.
Oh, what are you going to read next?
Ian Wellstead's book about Hounsworth.
Oh, yeah. I've got to get that. Oh, I've got so much to read. I can't bear it. I'm swimming in Italy.
This constitutes I mean, there's this. It's terrible, right? What happens to him? So, because I did my usual thing of having a look at the end as well as the beginning and the middle.
Do you do that?
Yeah, of course I do. Well, because this is, it's because it's a personal account. But he goes to France. He fights in France. He does all this Houndsworth stuff. It's absolutely amazing. They're counting German movement and all that sort of stuff, and they're relaying the information. And they're doing raids with jeeps, and they're dealing with the Mackie. And when he gets home, next day when Margot did arrive, it was to tell me she was in love with someone else and wanted a divorce. I ought to have remained in the Morvan after all. So
wow. How do you spell his surname? Ian what?
Wellstead.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. With a note.
SAS with the Mackie in action with the French resistance, and he wrote this in.
Yes,
he wrote it down in December 44, so it's sort of reasonable enough. And
he's also wrote with the SS across the Rhine into the heart of Hitler's Third Reich.
Yeah,
it's great. Okay, so you haven't come across this trilogy, have you?
No.
Ian W. Toll, he's written 3, and the second one is The Conquering Tide, which is the Pacific Islands from 1942 to 44. It's absolutely amazing.
Is it?
Yeah, it's just magisterial, I think is the right adjective for this, and it's really, really fascinating. So I've just been rereading that about, because that one includes all of the Guadalcanal stuff, but and I suppose he's coming at it from very much from a naval point of view, but I mean, God, all that stuff on Saipan and Philippine Sea is just incredible. But I think that's for another pod,
another
possibly.
Time. In which case, let's say farewell.
Let's knock this on the head.
Knock this on the head. We'll see you all very soon. Thanks very much for listening. And cheerio.
Cheerio.